The stagecoach rattled over the last stretch of dusty road toward Willow Creek, each jolt sending Margaret Byrne's heart leaping into her throat. Clutching her worn valise tighter, she stole a glance at her reflection in the small hand mirror. She'd carried all the way from Boston. Plain brown eyes stared back at her, framed by unremarkable brown hair tucked beneath a modest bonnet. Not pretty, not ugly, just plain. The very word that had decorated every rejection letter she'd received after sending her daguerreotype to potential husbands. Yet here she was, traveling to meet the one man who had accepted her. Sight unseen. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Willow Creek, 10 minutes. The driver called down, his voice barely audible over the thundering hooves and creaking wheels. Margaret tucked away her mirror and smoothed her travel-worn dress, the best one she owned, saved specifically for this moment. 28 years, old and desperate enough to travel 2,000 miles to marry a stranger who didn't even know what she looked like. The thought brought a bitter smile to her lips. First time out west. The elderly woman beside her asked kindly, her weathered face creased with a knowing smile. "Yes, ma'am." Margaret nodded, trying to keep the tremor from her voice. "I'm to be married." "Mail order?" The woman didn't bother hiding her curiosity. When Margaret nodded, the woman patted her hand. "Don't look so frightened, dear. My sister came out this way 20 years ago. Best thing she ever did, but Margaret doubted her situation would end as happily. The other brides in Boston's matrimonial agency had been young, pretty things with rosy cheeks and golden curls. They'd been snatched up quickly by ranchers and merchants seeking companionship in the lonely West. Margaret had waited 3 years before receiving her single reply from a rancher named Thomas Blackwood who hadn't requested a photograph. The stagecoach lurched to a halt in front of a weathered building with Willow Creek Station painted in fading letters across its facade. Margaret's hands trembled as she gathered her belongings. "Good luck, dear," the elderly woman whispered as Margaret stepped down into the dusty street. Willow Creek stretched before her, a single main street lined with wooden buildings, nothing like the bustling Boston streets she'd left behind. A few curious onlookers paused to study the stagecoach's newest arrival, their gazes sliding over her like water over stone. In Boston, she'd been invisible. Here, she was a spectacle. "Miss Byrne?" Margaret turned toward the voice, her practiced smile already in place. The man approaching was not what she'd expected. Rather than the rugged rancher of her imagination, she faced the town's postmaster, a thin, bespectacled man with an apologetic smile. "Yes, that's me. Ezra Mullen, town." "Postmaster?" He twisted his hat in his hands nervously. "I'm afraid I have some unexpected news regarding Mr. Blackwood." Margaret's heart sank. "Has something happened to him?" "Not exactly." Mullen glanced around, lowering his voice. "Mr. Blackwood's foreman sent word. There's been a misunderstanding. It seems Mr. Blackwood wasn't fully aware of the arrangements." Cold dread pooled in Margaret's stomach. "I don't understand." "Well, you see, it was his sister who wrote to you, Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood Hayes. She's been concerned about her brother's solitary nature since his accident and took it upon herself to find him a wife." Mullen's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "Mr. Blackwood only learned of the arrangement yesterday when preparations were being made for your arrival." The world seemed to tilt beneath Margaret's feet. "Are you saying he doesn't want to marry me?" The words scraped her throat like broken glass. "Mrs. Hayes is at the hotel waiting to speak with you," Mullen continued, avoiding the question. "She's arranged a room for you for the night." One night. Margaret's mind raced. One night before she'd be forced to spend what remained of her savings on a return ticket to a city that had no place for her anymore. The boarding house where she'd lived had already rented her room. Her position as a seamstress had been filled. The postmaster led her down the dusty street toward a two-story building with Willow Creek Hotel painted in elegant script across its awning. Every step felt like moving through molasses, her legs wooden and uncooperative. Inside the hotel lobby, a well-dressed woman rose from a plush chair, her expression a careful mask of politeness. Eleanor Blackwood Hayes was everything Margaret was not. Beautiful, elegant, confident. "Miss Byrne, thank you for coming all this way." Eleanor's voice was honey-sweet with an undertone of steel. "I cannot express how terrible I feel about this situation. Perhaps you could explain why I traveled 2,000 miles to marry a man who doesn't know I exist." Margaret surprised herself with the steadiness in her voice. Eleanor's perfect facade cracked slightly. "My brother has been different since his accident. 5 years ago, Thomas was the most eligible bachelor in 3 counties. Handsome, charming, and owner of the most prosperous ranch in the territory. Then there was an incident with a spooked horse. He suffered injuries to his face and eyes." "He's blind?" Margaret asked, pieces falling into place. "Partially. His right eye is completely sightless, his left severely compromised. He can make out shapes, light and dark, but little else." Eleanor sighed. "The physical scars healed, but something in him changed. He withdrew from society, buried himself in work, refused to consider marriage or family." Her eyes hardened. "I took matters into my own hands by deceiving both of us." "It wasn't a question. I had hoped." Eleanor hesitated. "When Thomas learned what I'd done, he was furious. He refused to consider the marriage, sight unseen." Her lips twisted in irony at the unfortunate phrase. "I'm deeply sorry, Miss Byrne. I've arranged your return passage for tomorrow morning." Margaret felt the foundations of her carefully constructed hopes crumble. She'd sold nearly everything she owned to make this journey, clinging to the promise of a new beginning. Now she would return to Boston penniless and humiliated. "Perhaps I could meet him," Margaret heard herself say, "before I leave." Eleanor's expression shifted to one of pity. "Miss Byrne, my brother was quite explicit. I've traveled 2,000 miles, Mrs. Hayes. I believe I'm entitled to at least meet the man I was to marry." A flicker of admiration crossed Eleanor's face. "You're more spirited than your letters," suggested. "Very well. Thomas is in town today meeting with the banker. I'll arrange an introduction, though I warn you, his temper has grown as sharp as his other senses since losing his sight." As evening approached, Margaret waited in the hotel dining room, her stomach too knotted for food. She'd spent the afternoon washing away the travel dust, changing into her only other dress, a serviceable blue cotton that emphasized what little color resided in her pale cheeks. The dining room hushed as the door swung open. Thomas Blackwood filled the doorway, tall and broad-shouldered, his presence commanding, despite the walking stick in his right hand. Margaret's breath caught as she took in his appearance. He was handsome still, devastatingly so, with strong features and dark hair streaked with silver at the temples, but the right side of his face bore the evidence of his accident. A long scar running from forehead to jaw, passing through a milky white, unseeing eye. The left eye, though clouded, moved restlessly, searching the dimness. Eleanor appeared at his side, murmuring something in his ear. His expression darkened, jaw tightening, as he turned toward the table where Margaret sat frozen. Each step he took toward her seemed to echo in Margaret's ears. She rose on unsteady legs as Eleanor made the introductions. "Thomas, this is Miss Margaret Byrne from Boston. Miss Byrne, my brother, Thomas Blackwood." "Mr. Blackwood." Margaret's voice emerged steadier than she felt. "I understand there's been a misunderstanding regarding our arrangement." Thomas Blackwood's undamaged brow rose slightly. Misunderstanding? Is that what we're calling my sister's meddling now? His voice was deep, with an edge like rough velvet. I apologize for your wasted journey, Miss Byrne. Rest assured, my sister will be covering your return expenses. Margaret lifted her chin, though he couldn't properly see the gesture. Actually, I was hoping we might speak privately before any final decisions are made. A muscle ticked in his jaw. There's nothing to discuss. I have no intention of marrying anyone, least of all a woman desperate enough to travel across the country to wed a stranger. The words struck like physical blows, but Margaret held her ground. I see. And here, I thought your sight was what was damaged, Mr. Blackwood, not your manners. A shocked silence fell over the dining room. Eleanor's eyes widened, and several diners nearby stopped pretending they weren't listening. For a moment, Thomas Blackwood stood perfectly still. Then unexpectedly a corner of his mouth twitched upward. You're right to rebuke me, Miss Byrne. My apology. He gestured to the chair opposite his. Perhaps we should sit after all. As Margaret resumed her seat, she caught Eleanor's surprised expression. Something told her Thomas Blackwood didn't apologize often and rarely changed his mind. Their conversation had only just begun, but in that tiny concession, Margaret saw something precious and unexpected. Hope. Thomas Blackwood's good eye studied Margaret with an intensity that made her feel as though he could see far more than she'd been told. His fingers, calloused from years of ranch work, drummed once on the tablecloth before stilling. I imagine. You have questions, he said, his deep voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. Several dozen, Margaret admitted, though I suspect you didn't come to dinner expecting an interrogation. A ghost of amusement crossed his face. After growing up with Eleanor, I'm well accustomed to being cornered. He gestured toward her untouched plate. You should eat. The stagecoach journey is brutal. Margaret picked up her fork, more to appease. To him than from hunger. Your sister mentioned an accident with a horse. His expression tightened. Did she? Eleanor has always had a talent for simplifying complicated situations. He touched the scar that ran from his brow to jaw, a gesture that seemed unconscious. 5 years ago, I was helping break a new stallion. Magnificent animal, but wilder than we initially judged. Something spooked him, a rattlesnake, we think. He reared, caught me with his hoof, then trampled me when I fell. Margaret winced, imagining the scene. The local doctor said I was lucky to be alive. Thomas continued, his tone matter of fact. I didn't feel particularly lucky at the time. And your sight? Margaret asked quietly. The right eye is completely gone. The left? He shrugged. I can distinguish light from dark, make out shapes and movement if there's enough contrast. On bright days, I can navigate familiar terrain without assistance. Margaret studied him, noting how he'd positioned himself with his back to the wall, giving his damaged vision the widest possible view of the room. His remaining eye never stopped, moving, compensating for what he'd lost. There was a strange dignity in it, not defeat, but adaptation. I apologize again for my sister's interference, Thomas said after a moment. Eleanor took it upon herself to save me from my solitude. His mouth twisted wryly. She fails to understand that solitude was a choice, not a sentence. Was it? Margaret found herself asking. A choice? His head tilted slightly, as though seeing her from a new angle. You're direct, Miss Byrne. I found that hesitation rarely serves any purpose but delay, she replied. We both know I'm returning. To Boston tomorrow. There seems little point in polite evasions. Thomas leaned back, something changing in his posture. Yes, I chose solitude. The accident altered how the world sees me and how I see it, quite literally. A hint of bitterness edged his words. I've had my fill of pitying glances and uncomfortable silences. I imagine pity would be galling. To someone who values self-sufficiency, his eyebrow rose. You've determined I value self-sufficiency after 10 minutes of conversation. You've been caring for a ranch with compromised vision for 5 years, rather than selling it and living off the proceeds in town, Margaret observed. That suggests a certain stubborn independence. For the first time, Thomas Blackwood laughed, a short, rusty sound, as though long disused. Stubborn independence. My foreman uses less complimentary terms. From the corner of her eye, Margaret noticed Eleanor watching them from across the room, barely disguising her interest behind a potted fern. Your sister appears to be monitoring our conversation with some concern. Thomas didn't turn. Eleanor's hopes are easily kindled. She's likely already planning the wedding she tricked us both into. And yet we're still talking, Margaret pointed out. I find you unexpected, Miss Byrne. His damaged gaze seemed to search her face. May I ask why you chose to become a mail-order bride? You speak like an educated woman. Margaret's fingers twisted the napkin in her lap. Being educated doesn't shield one from necessity. After my father died, our family home and business went to my brother. He married a woman who made it clear my presence was unwelcome. The familiar ache of rejection flared briefly. I worked as a seamstress, but the wages barely covered lodging. At 28, with no family connections or dowry, she let the sentence hang. So you bartered yourself instead, Thomas said bluntly. I prefer to think of it as practical matrimony, Margaret countered, refusing to flinch at his characterization. Many marriages among Boston's elite are arranged with far less consideration for compatibility and far more attention to bank accounts. Thomas opened his mouth to respond when a commotion erupted at the hotel entrance. A large man in trail-dusty clothes burst into the dining room, his face flushed with urgency. Mr. Blackwood, thank heaven you're still in town. The man removed his hat, crushing it nervously between massive hands. It's the North Pasture. Rustlers hit us at dusk. Jenkins took a bullet and they've driven off at least 30 head. Thomas was on his feet instantly, all traces of their almost companionable conversation vanishing. Carter's with Jenkins. Yes, sir. Doc's been sent for. Thomas turned toward Margaret, his face once again unreadable. You'll have to excuse me, Miss Byrne. It seems our conversation must be cut short. Of course, Margaret said, struck by how quickly he'd transformed from dinner companion to commanding rancher. Jackson, see that my horse is saddled, Thomas ordered, reaching for his walking stick. Eleanor hurried over, alarm clear on her face. Thomas, you can't possibly ride out there at night with your... I know my limitations better than anyone, Eleanor, he interrupted coldly. My men need me. At least take Robert with you, Eleanor pressed, referring to her husband. Thomas's jaw tightened. Robert's a banker, not a rancher. He'd be of more use counting the financial losses tomorrow. Margaret watched the siblings exchange, sensing layers of unspoken tension. Before she could process what she was doing, she heard herself speak. I could accompany you. 3 surprised faces turned toward her. You? Thomas asked, disbelief evident. I grew up riding, Margaret explained, though that was stretching the truth considerably, and I've cared for wounded men before during my father's illness. This isn't a Boston Park ride, Miss Byrne, Thomas said sharply, and night riding is dangerous even with perfect vision, which is precisely why you shouldn't go alone, Margaret countered. If your vision is compromised enough that your sister is concerned, having someone with functioning eyes beside you seems sensible. For a moment, Thomas looked genuinely speechless. His foreman glanced between them with undisguised curiosity. Miss Byrne, Thomas finally said, his voice tight with restraint, I appreciate the offer, but consider it the last request of a departing guest, Margaret interrupted. I leave tomorrow after all. Something unreadable crossed his face. frustration mingled with reluctant respect. "Jackson, have them saddle a horse for Miss Byrne as well." He turned to Eleanor before she could protest. "Have Robert send men from town to follow us. We'll need numbers if the rustlers are still nearby." As Thomas strode toward the door with surprising confidence for a man with limited vision, Eleanor caught Margaret's arm. "What are you doing?" she hissed. "You're a seamstress from Boston, not a frontierswoman." Margaret watched Thomas's retreating back, uncertain herself what had possessed her. "Sometimes necessity teaches us we're capable of more than we imagined," she said quietly, then followed him into the gathering darkness, preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 20 minutes later, Margaret clung to the saddle of a placid mare, fighting waves of regret. Her last horseback ride had been more than a decade ago on a gentle pony at her cousin's country estate. Nothing like this midnight gallop across unfamiliar terrain. Ahead of her, Thomas rode with astonishing confidence, his body moving in perfect rhythm with his horse. "Your eyes may be compromised, but your riding isn't," Margaret called, her voice bouncing with each jarring step of her mount. Thomas slowed slightly, allowing her to draw alongside. "I was on horseback before I could walk. Some things become part of you." He tilted his head, listening to her horse's labored breathing. "We'll slow the pace. Emma's not accustomed to carrying riders for distance." "Emma seems a gentle soul," Margaret managed, patting the mare's sweaty neck. Unlike her master, even in the darkness, she caught the flash of Thomas's teeth as he almost smiled. "I've been called many things, Miss Byrne, but gentle has never been among them." "What happened to make you so determined to face life alone?" The question escaped before she could consider its boldness. Thomas was silent for so long that Margaret thought he wouldn't answer. When he spoke, his voice had lost its defensive edge. "There was a woman," he said simply. "Catherine Vernon. We were to be married the month after my accident." "She left because of your injuries?" Margaret asked, already anticipating the story's direction. "No." Thomas's response was unexpected. "Catherine insisted the wedding proceed as planned. She was determined to prove her devotion was unchanged, but you didn't believe her." Thomas guided his horse around a boulder with remarkable precision. "I believed her intentions were sincere, but intentions aren't enough to sustain a lifetime, Miss Byrne." His voice hardened. "I saw the way she flinched when she thought I wouldn't. Notice, heard the whispers at church about her sacrifice, her bravery in marrying a ruined man." "So you ended it," Margaret guessed. "I released her from an obligation that would have slowly poisoned us both," he corrected. "Catherine married the banker's son from Cedar Ridge 6 months later. They have 3 children now." The simple statement carried an ocean of unspoken pain. Margaret found herself unexpectedly moved by his sacrifice, even as she questioned its necessity. "Did you ever consider that your decision robbed her of choice as surely as your accident robbed you of sight?" she asked quietly. Thomas reined his horse to an abrupt halt. "That's the North Ridge," he said, ignoring her question entirely. "My ranch is just beyond. We'll see lights from the bunkhouse soon." As if summoned by his words, a distant glow appeared. Through the trees, Thomas urged his horse forward, and Margaret followed, aware that a door had closed between them as surely as if a physical barrier had dropped. Whatever glimpse Thomas Blackwood had allowed her into his private pain was over. The solitary rancher had returned, and with their arrival at his home, Margaret's strange detour was about to end. What she couldn't have predicted was that their midnight ride had irrevocably altered the course of both their lives, and that the coming dawn would reveal far more than just the damage done by rustlers. The Blackwood Ranch emerged from the darkness like a fortress, a sprawling main house flanked by a bunkhouse, barn, and various outbuildings. Lanterns blazed from every window, and men moved with urgent purpose through the yard. The atmosphere crackled with tension, similar to what Margaret had witnessed during Boston dock fires, crisis bringing sharp focus and erasing all pretense. Thomas dismounted with practiced ease, tossing his reins to a waiting ranch hand. Before Margaret could attempt to dismount gracefully, strong hands circled her waist, lifting her effortlessly to the ground. "Thank you," she murmured, surprised by Thomas's unexpected assistance. "Your mare spooks easily," he replied, his voice matter of fact. "I heard her sidestep when you shifted weight." Margaret marveled at how his remaining senses compensated for what he'd lost. Where she saw darkness and confusion, he heard rhythms and movements invisible to her. A weathered man in his 50s approached, his shirt sleeve dark with what could only be blood. "Boss, glad you made it. Jenkins is inside with Doc Sullivan." Bullet went clean through his shoulder. "How many head did we lose, Carter?" Thomas asked, already moving toward the house with that same unsettling confidence on familiar ground. 37 by our count, all prime beef cattle. Carter fell into step beside them, giving Margaret a curious glance. They knew exactly which pasture to hit. Thomas's expression darkened. "Inside information. Appears so." Margaret followed them into the ranch house, momentarily stunned by the interior. She'd expected frontier simplicity, but the main room spoke of refined taste. Leather furniture, polished wood, bookshelves laden with volumes. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, antlers and a single landscape painting adorning the space above its mantel. A door opened, and a grey-haired man emerged, wiping his hands on a cloth spotted with blood. "Jenkins will live," he announced, without preamble. "Young fool's lucky the bullet missed anything vital." "Thank you, Doc," Thomas said, removing his hat. "Miss Byrne, this is Dr. Sullivan." "Doc, Miss Margaret Byrne from Boston." The doctor's eyebrows rose almost to his hairline. "Eleanor's mail-order bride. Heard you'd arrived today." His assessing gaze swept over her. "Didn't expect to find you here." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I offered to accompany Mr. Blackwood when news of the rustling arrived. Did you now?" Sullivan's expression shifted to one of amused interest. "First day in town and already riding to rustler emergencies. Boston must be more exciting than I've been led to believe." Thomas cut off further commentary. "Carter, gather the men in the bunkhouse. I want to know exactly what happened." "Doc, can Jenkins talk?" "Briefly," Sullivan cautioned. "Boy needs rest more than interrogation." Thomas nodded curtly. "Miss Byrne, if you'll excuse us." "Actually," the doctor interrupted, "I could use an extra pair of hands changing Jenkins' bandages before I leave." If Miss Byrne was sincere about her nursing experience, Margaret stepped forward before Thomas could object. "I'd be happy to assist." Sullivan led her to a small bedroom where a young man lay pale against white sheets, his right shoulder swathed. In bandages, Jenkins couldn't have been more than 20, with a boy's smooth face contorted in pain. "Ranch hand's first season," Sullivan explained quietly, laying out fresh bandages. "Poor kid probably never saw a gun fired in anger before tonight." Margaret rolled up her sleeves and washed her hands in the basin the doctor indicated. Working methodically alongside Sullivan, she helped clean and rebandage the wound, murmuring reassurances when Jenkins winced. "You've done this before," Sullivan observed as they finished. "My father was ill for 3 years before he passed," Margaret explained, adjusting the pillow beneath Jenkins's head. "Our housekeeper and I cared. For him," the young ranch hand's eyes fluttered open, focusing groggily on Margaret. An angel, he murmured. Not even close, she replied with a gentle smile. Just a visitor helping the doctor. Miss Byrne came all the way from Boston, Sullivan told the boy. Travelled west to marry the boss. Jenkins' eyes widened. Mr. Blackwood's getting married? No, Margaret corrected quickly. There was a misunderstanding. Sullivan gathered his supplies, a knowing look on his face. Funny thing about misunderstandings. Sometimes they lead exactly where we're meant to go. Before Margaret could respond, the bedroom door opened and Thomas entered. Though he couldn't have overheard their conversation, his expression was guarded. How is he? Thomas asked, his attention focused on the wounded man. He'll recover, Sullivan replied. Miss Byrne has been most helpful. Thomas nodded briefly. Carter's preparing to ride back to town. He'll escort Miss Byrne to the hotel. Tonight? Sullivan frowned. It's nearly midnight, Thomas. The boy needs monitoring, and Miss Byrne has proven herself capable. Let her stay in one of your guest rooms. A muscle worked in Thomas's jaw. That would be inappropriate. More inappropriate than sending a woman back on a 2-hour ride in the dark, Sullivan challenged. Mrs. Abernathy is still here, isn't she? Your housekeeper provides all the propriety needed. Thomas remained silent, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he sighed. Very well. Miss Byrne can use Eleanor's old room for the night. I don't wish to impose, Margaret said stiffly. Margaret. Thomas turned toward her voice, his clouded eyes finding her with unsettling accuracy. It's not an imposition, Miss Byrne. It's simple practicality. You offered assistance. We've accepted. His tone softened marginally. Mrs. Abernathy will show you to the room once she's finished preparing a meal for the men. After he left, Sullivan chuckled softly. Never thought I'd see Thomas Blackwood at a loss. You've accomplished in hours what Eleanor's been attempting for years. Which is what exactly? Margaret asked, getting under his skin. Sullivan closed his medical bag with a snap. I've known Thomas since he was born. Even before his accident, he kept the world at arm's length. Since then, the doctor shook his head. Well, let's just say, watching him interact with you is the most entertainment this old man has had in years. Margaret spent the next hour sitting with Jenkins, bathing his fevered forehead and ensuring he drank water whenever he woke. The hushed voices of men in the main room rose and fell as Thomas questioned his hands about the rustling incident. Eventually, a robust woman with iron-grey hair appeared in the doorway. You must be Miss Byrne, she said, her voice warm, but assessing. I'm Mrs. Abernathy, Mr. Blackwood's housekeeper. Dr. Sullivan says you're to stay the night. If it's not too much trouble, Margaret replied. No trouble at all. Eleanor's room is ready whenever you are. Mrs. Abernathy approached, checking Jenkins with practiced efficiency. I'll sit with him now. You must be exhausted. Margaret relinquished her chair gratefully. Her body ached from the unaccustomed horseback ride, and her eyes burned with fatigue. Following Mrs. Abernathy's directions, she found Eleanor's former bedroom, a lovely space with floral wallpaper and a 4-poster bed that looked impossibly inviting. A nightgown had been laid out, one of Eleanor's presumably, along, with a porcelain basin of warm water for washing. Margaret changed quickly, grateful to shed her travel-worn clothes. As she braided her hair for sleep, she caught her reflection in the vanity mirror. The same unremarkable features stared back at her, but something had changed. Her cheeks held more color, her eyes a spark that hadn't been there during the long Boston winter. One day in Willow Creek had awakened something she hadn't realized was dormant. Sleep came almost instantly when she slipped between the cool sheets. Her last conscious thought was of Thomas Blackwood's face when he'd helped her from her horse, not pitying or dismissive, but careful, attentive. Margaret woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar curtains. For a moment, she lay disoriented, before remembering the previous night's events. A quick glance at the small clock on the nightstand showed it was just past 7, later than she'd slept in years. Voices drifted from elsewhere in the house. The low rumble of men's conversation, the clatter of cookware. Today she would return to town and board the eastbound stage. The thought settled like a stone in her stomach. A soft knock at the door preceded Mrs. Abernathy's entrance with a tray. "Good morning, Miss Byrne. Thought you might appreciate breakfast before facing the day." "Thank you." Margaret sat up, suddenly conscious of her borrowed nightgown and dishevelled braid. "How is Jenkins this morning?" "Fever's down. Boy's tougher than he looks." Mrs. Abernathy set the tray across Margaret's lap, eggs, bacon, biscuits still steaming, and coffee that smelled like heaven. "Mr. Blackwood asked me to tell you Carter will drive you to town whenever you're ready." Margaret nodded, trying to ignore her disappointment that Thomas wouldn't be taking her himself. "Of course, the stagecoach leaves at noon." Mrs. Abernathy's hands stilled in the act of pouring coffee. "You're still planning to return east, then?" "That was always the arrangement," Margaret replied carefully, "especially now that there's been a big clarification regarding Mr. Blackwood's matrimonial intentions." The housekeeper's expression grew thoughtful. 5 years I've kept this house for Thomas Blackwood. Not once in that time has he brought a woman here. Not even his sister stays overnight anymore." She handed Margaret the coffee cup. "Yet here you sit, having breakfast in Eleanor's old room after helping tend to one of his wounded men." "Circumstances forced his hand," Margaret pointed out. "It was midnight, and Dr. Sullivan insisted. Thomas Blackwood hasn't done anything against his will since he was 10 years old," Mrs. Abernathy countered with a knowing smile. "He could have sent you back with his foreman last night, doctor's opinion or no." Before Margaret could formulate a response, another knock sounded, firmer this time. The door opened to reveal Thomas himself, already dressed for the day in a crisp white shirt and dark trousers. His hair was damp from washing, and he'd shaved, making the scar on his face stand out in starker relief. "Mrs. Abernathy, could you check on Jenkins? Doc Sullivan will be by again this morning." Though framed as a request, his tone made it clear. He wanted a private word with Margaret. The housekeeper departed with a barely concealed smile, closing the door just enough for propriety while leaving it noticeably ajar. Thomas remained near the threshold, one hand resting on the doorframe, his damaged eyes directed somewhere over Margaret's left shoulder. "I trust you slept well?" "Very well, thank you." Margaret was acutely aware of her state of undress beneath the blankets, though the high-necked nightgown was more modest than many day dresses. "Mrs. Abernathy has been most kind," he nodded, seeming to choose his next words carefully. "I wanted to thank you for your assistance last night. Jenkins is much improved this morning." "I did very little. Dr. Sullivan deserves the credit." Nevertheless, Thomas shifted, his posture uncharacteristically uncertain. "Carter is preparing the wagon to take you to town. The eastbound stage should arrive on schedule." "Yes," Mrs. Abernathy mentioned. "Noon." Margaret took a sip of cooling coffee to hide her disappointment at his businesslike tone. Thomas hesitated, then asked abruptly, "What will you do when you return to Boston?" The question caught her off guard. I'm not entirely certain," she admitted. "My position at the seamstress shop has been filled, my room at the boarding house as well." "Yet you're still determined to leave?" There was something in his voice she couldn't quite identify, not quite challenge, not quite concern. Margaret set down her coffee cup with a soft clink. "I came to marry a man who wanted a wife. That arrangement no longer exists, and if it did—" The question hung in the air between them, shocking them both. Margaret's heart thundered in her chest. "Mr. Blackwood, are you—" "Merely curious," he interjected quickly, "about what makes a woman travel 2,000 miles to marry a stranger." But the momentary vulnerability in his expression told a different story, one that made Margaret set aside caution for honesty. "I came because I wanted a purpose beyond mere survival," she said quietly. "In Boston, I was invisible. Too plain to marry well, too poor to live comfortably, too female to inherit what my father built. Here," she gestured toward the window where golden morning light illuminated dust motes dancing in the air. "Here, even a woman with unremarkable features might build something worthwhile." Thomas was silent for so long that Margaret thought he might simply leave. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped to a near whisper. "When I lost my sight, I learned that the world consists of far more than what we see with our eyes." He moved further into the room, his steps measured and deliberate. "Last night, in the darkness, you were the only person who didn't try to take my arm or guide my movements. You trusted me to know my own capabilities." Margaret watched him approach, hardly daring to breathe. "I don't know what you look like, Miss Byrne," Thomas continued, stopping at the foot of her bed. "My sister described you as modest in appearance. Eleanor's diplomatic way of saying plain, I suspect." A flush of embarrassment heated Margaret's cheeks. "But I know the steadiness in your voice when you helped Jenkins," he went on. "I know the courage it took to ride out in the darkness with a half-blind stranger. I know the scent of lavender that clings to your hair." His hands gripped the bedpost. "These things tell me far more about you than any mirror ever could." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Margaret found herself speechless, a woman who had always prided herself on practical directness, suddenly unable to form a coherent thought. Thomas stepped back, composure returning like a mask, sliding into place. "Forgive me, that was inappropriate." "No," Margaret managed, finding her voice at last. "It was honest." A corner of his mouth lifted in that almost smile she was coming to recognize. "Carter will be ready whenever you are, Miss Byrne. Take your time with breakfast." He turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. "Whatever you decide, I wish you well." As the door closed behind him, Margaret stared at her cooling breakfast, mind racing. For the first time since receiving Eleanor's letter months ago, she found herself at a genuine crossroads, not pushed by necessity, but pulled by possibility. The stagecoach would depart at noon. She had less than 4 hours to decide which direction her life would take. Margaret stood at the window of Eleanor's room, watching ranch hands move purposefully across the yard. The sun illuminated the landscape beyond, rolling hills dotted with cattle, a distant line of mountains painted in watercolor blues. Nothing. Like the brick confines of Boston, with its narrow streets and smoke-stained buildings, she changed back into her blue dress, the fabric still bearing dust from yesterday's journey. Her hair was pinned in its usual practical style, her small valise packed and waiting by the door, yet she remained by the window, reluctant to call for Carter. A knock drew her attention. Mrs. Abernathy entered, carrying a bundle wrapped in brown. "Paper. Thought you might need this for your journey," the housekeeper said, setting the package on the bed. "Some provisions, bread, cheese, dried apple slices. Stagecoach rides can be long between proper meals." "That's very thoughtful," Margaret replied, touched by the unexpected kindness. Mrs. Abernathy smoothed the bedspread, her movements unhurried. "It's not my place to speak on personal matters," she began, contradicting her words with her tone. "But I've watched Mr. Blackwood retreat from life these past 5 years. This morning was the first time I've seen him flustered since before his accident." "I leave at noon," Margaret reminded her gently. The housekeeper nodded, her expression carefully neutral. "Carter's ready whenever you are, though Mr. Blackwood mentioned you might like to see the ranch before departing." She moved toward the door. "Said something about showing you the orchard." Margaret's heart quickened. "Did he?" "Eastern edge of the property. Quite beautiful this time of year with the trees flowering." Mrs. Abernathy's eyes held meaning beyond her casual words. He's there now, seeing to irrigation repairs. After the housekeeper left, Margaret stood undecided, her hand resting on her packed valise. The sensible choice was clear. Allow Carter to drive her to town, board the eastbound stage, and return to the world she knew, yet Thomas's words from their morning conversation echoed in her mind. When I lost my sight, I learned that the world consists of far more than what we see with our eyes. 20 minutes later, Margaret followed a well-worn path toward a cluster of trees in the distance. She'd asked a stable boy for directions, earning a curious look but clear instructions. The morning air carried the promise of warmth, though. The breeze still held a springtime crispness. The orchard announced itself first through scent, the sweet perfume of apple blossoms carried on the wind. As she rounded a gentle slope, rows of trees appeared before her, their branches laden with delicate white and pink flowers. Thomas stood beneath one of the trees, his back to her, head tilted as though listening to the bees buzzing among the blossoms. Without turning, he said, "I wondered if you'd come." Margaret stopped, surprised. "How did you know it was me?" "Your footsteps," he replied, finally turning. "Light but purposeful, unlike my ranch hands who trudge or Mrs. Abernathy who marches. You hear the world differently than most," Margaret observed, approaching to stand beside him. "Necessity rather than virtue." Thomas reached up, fingers gently testing the firmness of forming fruit beneath the flowers. "My father planted these trees when I was a boy, said a ranch needed more than just cattle to thrive." Margaret watched his hands move with such care among the delicate blossoms. "He sounds like a wise man." He was. Thomas's expression softened. "He'd have liked you." The simple statement carried unexpected weight. Margaret struggled to find an appropriate response. "Mrs. Abernathy said you wanted to show me the orchard," she finally said. "Did she?" A smile tugged at his mouth. "Mrs. Abernathy has developed an unfortunate tendency toward matchmaking in her advancing years." Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I apologize for the intrusion." "Don't," Thomas interrupted. "I'm glad you came." He gestured toward a wooden bench positioned to overlook both the orchard and the distant mountains. "Will you sit with me a moment?" They settled side by side, the bench just wide enough that their shoulders didn't quite touch. Silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but laden with unspoken thoughts. "When do you leave?" Thomas finally asked. "Noon," Margaret replied. "If I go." His head turned sharply toward her. "You're considering staying?" "I'm considering my options." Margaret smoothed her skirt, organizing her thoughts. "In Boston, I had none. Here, at least, there might be possibilities." "What sort of possibilities?" "Practical ones," she answered honestly. "I noticed the town has no seamstress shop. With my experience, I could perhaps establish one." The idea had formed during her sleepless hours the previous night, a desperate attempt to find a reason to remain in Willow Creek. Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Willow Creek could certainly use a good seamstress. Then perhaps I'll speak with the bank about a small loan." Margaret tried to sound more confident than she felt. Starting a business required capital she didn't possess. "And where would you live?" "The hotel is suitable for travelers, not permanent residents. There must be rooms for rent in town." Margaret's voice betrayed her uncertainty. Thomas turned more fully toward her, his clouded gaze directed at her face with unnerving accuracy. "Miss Byrne, Margaret, are we pretending this conversation is about opening a seamstress shop?" The directness of his question stole her breath. "What else would it be about?" "Us." The single syllable hung in the air between them. "The possibility of us." "There is no us," Margaret said softly. "You made your position quite clear when I arrived." "I made a judgment before I knew you," Thomas admitted, "based on assumptions that have proven incorrect." A cautious hope unfurled within Margaret's chest. What assumptions? that you sought a husband out of desperation alone, that you would recoil from my scars and limitations, that you would demand more than I was willing to give. His hand found the bench between them, fingers splayed on the weathered wood. In less than a day, you've challenged every one of those assumptions. Margaret stared at his hand, mere inches from her own. What are you saying, Thomas? I'm saying the stagecoach leaves at noon, he replied, his voice low and measured. And I'm asking you not to be on it. For what purpose? Margaret pressed, needing clarity. As your wife, your housekeeper, your nurse for wounded ranch hands. As yourself, Thomas answered. Nothing more or less, at least to begin. I'm asking for time, to know you better, to let you know me. A courtship, Margaret clarified, hardly believing the turn of events. An old-fashioned concept, Thomas acknowledged with a half-smile, but perhaps appropriate for our unconventional beginning. Hope and doubt warred within her. Your sister arranged for a bride, not a courtship. My sister overstepped, Thomas countered. This is my decision to make my life to live. His hand shifted closer to hers. What do you say, Margaret Byrne? Will you stay in Willow Creek? Will you give us both the chance to discover if there's something worth building here? Margaret looked out over the flowering orchard, the ranch beyond, the endless sky above. She thought of her cramped room in Boston, the endless days of stitching garments for women who looked through her rather than at her, the lonely nights with nothing but memories to keep her company. Then she looked at the man beside her, damaged but not defeated, solitary but not content in his solitude. A man who had lost one way of seeing the world, but gained another, more profound vision in its place. Her fingers moved across the rough wood to cover his. Yes, she said simply, I'll stay. Thomas's hand turned beneath hers, their fingers interlacing. The connection was tentative, but unmistakable. A beginning, rather than an ending. I can offer you a proposition, he said after a moment. The cottage near the main house was built for the foreman, but Carter prefers staying in the bunkhouse with the men. It's small, but comfortable. You could live there while establishing your seamstress business, without the expense of town lodgings. People would talk, Margaret pointed out. People always talk, Thomas replied with a dismissive gesture. Besides, Mrs. Abernathy lives in the main house. Propriety would be maintained. Margaret considered the arrangement. It was unusual but practical, giving them proximity to explore their connection while maintaining appropriate boundaries. There is one condition, she said finally. Thomas's eyebrow rose. Which is? That you allow me to pay rent, a fair amount. Not charity. A smile spread across his face, the first full, unguarded smile she'd seen from him. It transformed his features, softening the habitually stern expression and emphasizing his handsomeness rather than his scars. You are a surprising woman, Margaret Byrne. I've simply learned that independence and dignity are worth protecting, she replied. They rose from the bench by mutual accord and began walking back toward the main house, their hands occasionally brushing but not quite holding. We should inform Eleanor, Thomas said suddenly. She'll be insufferably pleased with herself. Margaret laughed, the sound carrying across the orchard. At least someone's matchmaking efforts bore fruit. Speaking of fruit, Thomas gestured toward the trees. These apples will ripen by late summer. Mrs. Abernathy makes preserves that would shame your finest Boston confectioners. As they walked, Thomas spoke of the ranch, its rhythms and challenges, its history and future. Margaret listened, recognizing that he was sharing more than facts. He was offering her a glimpse of the life they might build together. When they reached the ranch yard, Carter was waiting with the wagon, her valise already loaded in the back. The foreman looked between them with poorly concealed curiosity. Change of plans, Carter, Thomas announced. Miss Byrne will be staying with us for a while. Please prepare the foreman's cottage for her. Carter's weathered face split into a grin. "Yes, sir. Right away, sir." As the foreman hurried off, Thomas turned to Margaret. "I should see to Jenkins and hear what Doc Sullivan has to say about his recovery." "Of course," Margaret replied, suddenly uncertain now that their private moment had ended. Thomas hesitated, then reached for her hand, his fingers finding hers unerringly. "Welcome to Blackwood Ranch, Miss Byrne," he said formally, though his touch conveyed something far more personal. "I believe we both have much to discover in the days ahead." As his fingers released hers, Margaret realized that for the first time in years, she was looking toward the future with something more substantive than mere hope. She was looking toward it with anticipation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Eleanor Blackwood Hayes arrived at the ranch that afternoon in a flurry of expensive perfume and barely contained excitement. She found Margaret in the foreman's cottage, unpacking her meager belongings, while Mrs. Abernathy offered suggestions for improvements that had been needed for years. "When Carter rode into town with news you weren't leaving, I could scarcely believe it," Eleanor exclaimed, embracing Margaret as though they were long-lost sisters. "Thomas actually asked you to stay." "It's a temporary arrangement," Margaret clarified, disentangling herself from Eleanor's enthusiastic embrace. "I'm renting the cottage while establishing a seamstress business." Eleanor exchanged knowing glances with Mrs. Abernathy. "Of course, purely practical." "It is practical," Margaret insisted, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. "And appropriate." "Appropriate isn't a word I'd associate with my brother," Eleanor said with a laugh. "Stubborn, yes. Infuriating, certainly. But this—" she gestured around, "the cottage. This is unprecedented." Mrs. Abernathy nodded sagely. 5 years, not a single visitor invited to stay. Now suddenly we're preparing the cottage and airing out linens. "I'm sure Mr. Blackwood is simply being kind," Margaret protested, though she knew there was more to Thomas's invitation than mere kindness. "Thomas doesn't do anything out of simple kindness," Eleanor countered. "Whatever his reasons, they run deeper than charity." She surveyed the cottage with a critical eye. "This place needs curtains and proper dishes, and it's perfect as it is," Margaret interrupted, unwilling to be swept away by Eleanor's enthusiasm. "Please, I appreciate your help, but I'd prefer to make this space my own, in my own time." Eleanor looked momentarily taken aback, then smiled. "You have more backbone than I initially gave you credit for, Miss Byrne. My brother may have met his match." After Eleanor and Mrs. Abernathy departed, Margaret sat on the edge of the small bed, suddenly overwhelmed by the day's developments. The cottage was indeed cozy. A main room with a cast-iron stove, wooden table and chairs, and a small sitting area with a rocking chair by the window. The bedroom was just large enough for a bed and dresser, with a window overlooking a kitchen garden. Simple but clean, with possibilities for personalization. A tentative knock at the open door drew her attention. Thomas stood in the doorway, a bundle under his arm. "Eleanor descended upon you, I presume?" he asked, his expression sympathetic. "Like a whirlwind," Margaret confirmed. "She has grand plans for curtains and dishes." Thomas sighed. "My sister has never understood the virtue of simplicity." He held out the bundle. "These are account books from the last seamstress who worked in Willow Creek. Mrs. Hopkins passed away last winter, leaving a gap you might fill. I thought they might help you establish pricing." Margaret accepted the ledgers, touched by his thoughtfulness. "Thank you. This will be invaluable. Carter mentioned you might need transportation to town tomorrow. He's happy to drive you to speak." "With the banker?" Thomas shifted his weight, suddenly appearing less certain. "Or I could take you myself." "Wouldn't that fuel gossip?" Margaret asked. "Undoubtedly," he acknowledged with a wry smile, "though I find myself increasingly unconcerned with Willow Creek's opinion." Margaret studied him, noting the subtle changes. Since their morning conversation, a relaxed set to his shoulders, less guardedness in his expression. "In that case," she said, "I'd welcome your company." Thomas nodded, pleased. 8 o'clock? We could have breakfast at the hotel restaurant before meeting with the banker. 8 would be perfect. He turned to leave, then paused. "Margaret?" "Yes?" "Are you certain about this? You arrived expecting marriage, and instead find yourself alone in a foreman's cottage with uncertain prospects." Margaret considered his question carefully. "I arrived expecting security," she corrected. "What I've found instead is possibility. That's worth far more." His expression softened. "I'll see you at 8 then." As twilight settled over the ranch, Margaret sat in the rocking chair by the window, watching shadows lengthen across the yard. From this vantage point, she could see the main house, lamplight glowing in its windows, and beyond it the bunkhouse where the ranch hands were gathering after the day's work. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of belonging, not because she was wanted for her appearance or status, but because someone saw value in who she truly was. Whether their cautious beginning would blossom into something more remained uncertain, but uncertainty had never felt so full of promise. As night fell completely, Thomas emerged from the main house and stood on the porch, his face turned toward her cottage. Though she knew he couldn't see her clearly in the darkness, Margaret raised her hand in greeting. To her surprise, he raised his hand in return, as though sensing her presence even without seeing it, a silent acknowledgement of the connection forming between them, as delicate and hopeful as the apple blossoms in the orchard. 2 weeks passed with the speed of seasons changing. Margaret established herself in the cottage, transforming the simple space with small touches: wildflowers in a jar on the table, a patchwork cushion on the rocking chair, the ledgers, Thomas, provided neatly arranged on a small desk she'd purchased second-hand from the general store. Her meeting with the banker had proven successful, partly due to Thomas's presence. Mr. Hayes, Eleanor's husband, had seemed unsurprised by their joint appearance and offered Margaret a modest loan to purchase a sewing machine, fabrics, and other necessities. The former seamstress's shop remained vacant, and with a handshake, Margaret became its new tenant. Each morning, Carter drove her to town in the ranch wagon, and each evening he collected her for the return journey. The rhythm of these days brought a contentment Margaret hadn't expected, measuring clients for new dresses during daylight hours, taking dinner with Thomas and Mrs. Abernathy in the main house, then retiring to her cottage to complete stitching by lamplight. And always, there was Thomas. He'd begun accompanying her on evening walks around the property, his confident stride matching hers as he narrated the history of various buildings and landmarks. Though they maintained a proper distance when others were present, Margaret had grown accustomed to the brush of his hand against hers when they were alone, a tentative language of touch evolving between them. "Mrs. Finley wants her dress ready by Saturday," Margaret explained as they walked the path bordering the creek. "She's convinced that wearing blue to the Founders' Day celebration will finally convince Sheriff Taylor to propose." Thomas's mouth quirked with amusement. "Sheriff Taylor has been studiously avoiding matrimony for 15 years. Mrs. Finley might need more than a blue dress to change his mind." "You'd be surprised at the power some people attribute to proper attire," Margaret replied, smiling. "I've had Boston matrons convinced that certain colors would secure advantageous marriages for their daughters. And did they secure those marriages?" "Occasionally, though I suspect it had more to do with substantial dowries than fabric choices. They reached a fallen log overlooking the creek, their customary resting spot. The evening air carried the sweet scent of grasses and wildflowers, insects humming in the growing twilight. As they sat, Thomas seemed unusually pensive. "You're quiet tonight," Margaret observed. He turned toward her voice. I received a letter today from a cattle buyer in San Francisco. He's interested in purchasing stock. That sounds promising. It would be a significant contract, Thomas confirmed, but it would require me to travel there for negotiations. Understanding dawned. You're concerned about traveling. His jaw tightened slightly. I haven't left Willow Creek since my accident. The ranch, the town, I know every inch by memory, by sound and texture. San Francisco would be... He trailed off. Challenging, Margaret supplied. Disorienting, he corrected. Possibly humiliating. Business negotiations require confidence and perception. My limitations would be apparent. Margaret considered his dilemma. What if you weren't alone? Thomas's head tilted slightly. Carter has responsibilities here. I wasn't speaking of Carter. Margaret took a breath, gathering her courage. I could accompany you. Thomas went still. You would do that? It makes practical sense, she reasoned, though her racing heart had little to do with practicality. I need fabrics unavailable in Willow Creek. San Francisco merchants would have suitable selections. A convenient justification, Thomas noted, his voice warming. But we both know your presence would invite speculation. People speculate already. Margaret countered. Half the town believes I'm your mistress, the other half that I'm your nurse. The truth hardly seems to matter. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. The truth matters to me, he finally said. And the truth is, I find myself increasingly unwilling to contemplate any significant journey without you beside me. The words sent a tremor through Margaret's carefully maintained composure. Then I'll accompany you to San Francisco, she said softly, as your business partner, if anyone asks. And if I wish you to be more than that? Thomas's question hung in the evening air. Margaret's breath caught. What are you asking, Thomas? His hand found hers on the log between them, fingers interlacing with familiar ease. I'm asking if you would consider becoming my wife, not out of necessity or convenience, but because these past weeks have shown me what it means to truly see someone, even without fully functioning eyes. Though she had begun to hope for this moment, its arrival left Margaret momentarily speechless. Are you certain? She finally managed. You barely know me. I know that you hum when you're concentrating on detailed stitching, Thomas replied. I know you take your coffee with milk, but no sugar. I know your footsteps quicken when you're excited and slow when you're tired. His fingers tightened around hers. I know the sound of your laughter makes me want to be worthy of hearing it. Again. Tears pricked at Margaret's eyes. Thomas, I understand if you need time, he continued, or if your feelings don't align with mine. The cottage remains yours regardless, as does my support for your business. Margaret turned toward him, studying the face that had become so dear to her, the strong jaw, the clouded eyes that somehow saw more clearly than most, the scar that spoke of survival rather than defeat. I don't need time, she said quietly. I came to Willow Creek seeking security, through marriage to a stranger. Instead, I found independence, purpose, and she hesitated, then finished with simple honesty, I found you. Is that a yes? Thomas asked, uncharacteristic uncertainty in his voice. Yes, Margaret affirmed, though I think we should maintain our current living arrangements until the wedding. For propriety's sake, Thomas laughed, the sound echoing across the creek. Always practical, Miss Byrne. Soon to be Mrs. Blackwood, she corrected, the name strange yet right on her tongue. With unexpected boldness, Thomas raised his free hand to her face, fingertips gently tracing her features, her brow, her cheekbones, the curve of her lips. I wish I could see you, he murmured. You see me more clearly than anyone ever has, Margaret replied, turning her face into his palm. When his lips found hers, it wasn't with blind fumbling but precise intention, a kiss as deliberate and certain as the man himself. Margaret leaned into it, her hand coming to rest against his chest, where his heart beat steadily beneath her palm. The distant dinner bell from the main house broke them apart. Thomas rose, drawing Margaret up with him. "Mrs. Abernathy won't appreciate us being late for dinner, especially after I requested her apple pie specifically for tonight." "You were that confident in my answer?" Margaret asked, arching an eyebrow he couldn't see, but would certainly hear in her tone. Thomas smiled, offering his arm. "Not confident, hopeful." As they walked back toward the house, Margaret felt the future unfurling before them, different from anything she had imagined when boarding the stagecoach in Boston, yet somehow more right than any dream she might have harbored. They were halfway across the yard when Eleanor's distinctive carriage came racing up the drive, her husband handling the reins with unusual urgency. The vehicle had barely stopped before Eleanor flung herself out, face flushed with excitement. "Thomas, Margaret, thank heavens you're both here. The most extraordinary thing has happened." Thomas's posture tensed beside Margaret. "What's wrong? Is someone hurt?" "Nothing's wrong," Eleanor assured him, practically vibrating with news. "It's about your cattle, the ones stolen in the rustling." "What about them?" Thomas asked cautiously. Robert Hayes climbed down from the carriage more sedately. "The sheriff from Cedar Ridge sent a telegram. They've recovered most of your stolen. Heard in a canyon near the territorial border." "All 37 head?" Thomas asked, disbelief evident in his voice. 32 survived, Hayes clarified. "They arrested 2 men trying to move them across the border. The sheriff believes they were part of the same gang that attacked your ranch." Eleanor clutched Margaret's arm. "But that's not even the most remarkable part." She turned to her brother. "Thomas, one of the men they captured, it's Lucas Reed." The name meant nothing to Margaret, but she felt Thomas go completely still beside her. "That's impossible," he said flatly. "Lucas Reed died in the Cimarron fire 4 years ago." "Apparently not," Hayes replied grimly. "The sheriff's description matches perfectly, including the burn scars on his left arm. He's being held in Cedar Ridge until the circuit judge arrives next week." A muscle worked in Thomas's jaw, his expression darkening with each word. "I need to go there. I need to see him." "See him?" Eleanor echoed with a nervous laugh. "Thomas, you can't." "Figure of speech, Eleanor," Thomas cut her off sharply. "I need to be there when they question him." Margaret touched his arm gently. "Who is Lucas Reed?" For a moment, she thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice was tight with controlled emotion. "Lucas Reed was my best friend. We grew up together, worked this ranch together." He swallowed hard. "He was with me the day of my accident." "The day you were trampled," Margaret clarified. "The day I was deliberately thrown from my horse," Thomas corrected, the bitter truth falling like a stone between them. "Someone spooked that stallion intentionally, not a rattlesnake, a gunshot, and Lucas was the only person close enough to have fired it." The revelation stunned Margaret into silence. Eleanor pressed her handkerchief to her lips, while Hayes looked grimly unsurprised. "I always suspected," Thomas continued, his voice dangerously calm, "but there was no proof. When the Cimarron saloon burned down months later and Lucas was reportedly among the dead, I thought that was the end of it." His hand found Margaret's, gripping it almost painfully. "Now it seems he's returned to finish what he started." "You can't know that," Eleanor protested. "Perhaps it's a coincidence." "There are no coincidences of this magnitude," Thomas replied. "If Lucas is alive and stealing my cattle, there's purpose behind it." He turned toward the main house. "Carter," he called, his voice carrying across the yard, "prepare for a journey to Cedar Ridge tomorrow at first light." As the foreman emerged from the bunkhouse acknowledging the order, Thomas turned back to Margaret. "Our engagement celebration will have to wait, it seems." "I'm coming with you," Margaret said firmly. Thomas shook his head. "This could be dangerous." Lucas Reed is a dangerous man. All the more reason you shouldn't face this alone, she insisted. Besides, I've never broken an engagement before, but I imagine abandoning one's fiancé at the first sign of trouble would be a poor beginning. Despite the gravity of the situation, Thomas's expression softened. You're remarkably stubborn, Miss Byrne. A quality we apparently share, Mr. Blackwood. Eleanor looked between them, momentarily distracted from the crisis. Engagement? When did this happen? Approximately 10 minutes ago, Margaret replied, unable to keep a hint of pride from her voice, before your dramatic arrival. Oh. Eleanor clasped her hands together, torn between delight at the news and concern about Lucas Reed. That's wonderful, but the timing is what it is, Thomas interrupted. We leave for Cedar Ridge at dawn. He squeezed Margaret's hand once before releasing it. I need to speak with Carter about preparations. As Thomas strode toward the bunkhouse, Eleanor turned worried eyes to Margaret. You don't understand what you're walking into. Lucas Reed was obsessed with my brother. Their friendship was intense, almost unhealthy. After Thomas's success grew while Lucas remained just a ranch hand, something changed in him. You believe he caused the accident? Margaret asked quietly. Eleanor glanced toward her husband, who nodded grimly. We've always suspected. Lucas disappeared immediately afterward, while Thomas was fighting for his life. When news came of his death, it seemed like justice. She shuddered. If he's truly alive and targeting Thomas again, then Thomas will need allies, Margaret finished resolutely, which is precisely why I'm going to Cedar Ridge. As darkness fell completely over the ranch, Margaret returned to her cottage to pack for the journey. Through the window, she could see lanterns moving in the main house and bunkhouse as preparations continued. The peaceful evening that had held her engagement had transformed into something ominous, a shadow from Thomas's past, threatening the future they'd just begun to envision. She opened the small trunk containing her few possessions, selecting practical items for travel. As she folded a shawl, movement outside her window caught her attention, a figure standing at the edge of the property, partially hidden among the trees. The stance was unfamiliar. Not Thomas, nor Carter, nor any of the ranch hands she'd come to recognize. For a moment the figure remained motionless, seemingly watching the cottage. Then, as Margaret moved closer to the window for a better look, the stranger melted back into the darkness. A chill ran down her spine as she closed the curtains firmly. Perhaps Lucas Reed wasn't the only ghost returning to haunt Blackwood Ranch. And perhaps Cedar Ridge wasn't the only place danger lurked. Dawn broke in watercolor streaks of pink and gold as the small party departed Blackwood Ranch. Margaret rode beside Thomas, with Carter and 2 ranch hands following behind. No one had questioned her presence. Thomas's firm announcement that his fiancée would accompany them had silenced any potential objections. Fiancée. The word still felt foreign to Margaret, like a dress she hadn't quite grown accustomed to wearing. Their courtship had progressed with unexpected swiftness, yet felt more genuine than any relationship she'd known in Boston. You're quiet, Thomas observed, as their horses navigated a narrow trail between scrubby pines. I was thinking about how quickly life can change, Margaret replied. 3 weeks ago I was stepping off the stagecoach, expecting to be rejected, and sent back east. Thomas guided his horse around a boulder with practiced ease. Do you regret staying? Not for a moment. She studied his profile, noting the tension in his jaw. Are you having second thoughts about our engagement? You never. His voice softened briefly before hardening again. But I'm bringing you into a situation I don't fully understand. If Lucas truly did cause my accident, and now he's returned, we'll face it together, Margaret said firmly. They rode in companionable silence as the sun climbed higher. Cedar Ridge lay a half-day's ride from Willow Creek, close enough for commerce, far enough that visits were infrequent. The terrain grew increasingly rugged, rocky outcroppings jutting from the earth like ancient bones. "There was a time I could have described the colors of these hills to you," Thomas said unexpectedly. "The way they change from mustard yellow near the bases to rust red at the peaks, the silvery green of sage after rain." Margaret heard the unspoken loss in his words. "Perhaps you could teach me to describe them to you instead." His mouth curved slightly. "You would do that?" "Of course, though I doubt my descriptions would match a rancher's knowledge." "I'd hear them through your eyes," Thomas said. "That would make them new again." A shout from Carter interrupted their conversation. The foreman had ridden ahead to scout and now waved from a ridge. "Riders coming," he called. "4 men, moving fast." Thomas straightened in his saddle, hand moving instinctively to the rifle secured beside him. "Get behind me," he told Margaret. "I'll do no such thing," she replied, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "I didn't come to hide at the first sign of trouble." Before Thomas could argue, the approaching riders crested a hill. Margaret exhaled in relief when she saw the badge glinting on the lead rider's chest, the Sheriff of Cedar Ridge. "Blackwood," the sheriff called as they drew near, "was coming to find you." The parties converged, dust swirling around the horses. Sheriff Hollis was a barrel-chested man with a silver mustache and weathered face. He nodded to Margaret before turning his attention back to Thomas. "Word travels fast," Thomas commented. "Fast as a telegraph wire," Hollis confirmed. "Figured you'd be on your way once you heard about Reed." His expression grew grim. "That's why I was coming to meet you." "There's been a development." Thomas went still. "What kind of development?" "Reed's escaped." Hollis removed his hat, wiping sweat from his brow. "Last night, during the guard change, someone helped him. Took out my deputy with a blow to the head." Carter swore softly. The ranch hands exchanged nervous glances. "Any idea where he went?" Thomas asked, his voice dangerously calm. "North, we think. Got a posse tracking him, but he had hours of darkness." Hollis replaced his hat. "I came to warn you personally. If Reed caused your accident like folks suspect, he might head for your ranch to finish what he started." Margaret's mind flashed to the figure she'd glimpsed outside her cottage the previous night. "Sheriff," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, "could Reed have known about Thomas coming to Cedar Ridge before he escaped?" Hollis frowned. "Possibly. My deputy mentions the Blackwood cattle being recovered to anyone who'd listen." "Why?" "I saw someone watching the cottage last night," Margaret explained. "A stranger standing at the edge of the property." Thomas turned toward her sharply. "You didn't mention this." "There wasn't time. With the preparations for departure—" "Ma'am," Hollis interrupted, "are you certain it wasn't one of the ranch hands?" "The posture was unfamiliar," Margaret replied, "and when I moved toward the window, they disappeared into the trees." Thomas's expression hardened. If Reed's already been to the ranch, Eleanor and the others could be in danger. He wheeled his horse around. "Carter, ride back immediately. Take Jackson with you." "We should all return," Margaret suggested. "No," Thomas countered firmly. "I need to deal with Reed once and for all. You'll be safer in Cedar Ridge until this is resolved." Margaret recognized the set of his jaw, the same unyielding determination she'd witnessed when he confronted the rustlers. "I didn't agree to marry you only to be sent away at the first sign of danger." "This isn't up for debate," Thomas replied. "Reed is dangerous." "Which is precisely why you shouldn't face him alone," Margaret interrupted. "Your vision—" "My vision is exactly why Reed nearly succeeded in killing me 5 years ago," Thomas snapped, the words echoing across the hillside. A heavy silence followed. Sheriff Hollis cleared his throat. "Miss Byrne," Margaret supplied. "Soon to be Blackwood." "Miss Byrne, no disrespect intended, but Thomas is right. Reed's unhinged. During his brief stay in my jail, he did nothing but mutter about settling scores and taking back what was his." What could he possibly think was his? Margaret asked. The ranch, Thomas answered quietly. Lucas always believed he deserved an ownership stake. His father worked our land alongside mine, died there too. Lucas felt entitled to compensation beyond his wages. Understanding dawned on Margaret. He resented your success. Resented that I inherited everything while he inherited nothing, Thomas corrected. When I offered him a foreman's position instead of partnership, something in him changed. Hollis nodded grimly. That tracks with what he was saying in his cell. Kept going on about rightful claims and blood debts. Carter, who had remained silent during the exchange, spoke up. Boss, with respect, I think Miss Byrne should stay with you. If Reed's already been to the ranch, he knows about her. She could be a target either way. Thomas's knuckles whitened around his reins as he weighed the options. Finally, he nodded curtly. We'll all continue to Cedar Ridge. Jackson and Williams can return to warn Eleanor and secure the ranch. As the two ranch hands departed back toward Blackwood Ranch, the remaining party continued toward Cedar Ridge. The mood had darkened considerably, easy conversation replaced by vigilant silence. Margaret rode close to Thomas, studying his profile. The revelation about Lucas Reed had awakened something hard and unforgiving in him, a glimpse of the man he must have been before his accident, before he'd learned to navigate the world through other senses. You're angry, she observed quietly, keeping her voice low enough that only he could hear. I'm focused, he corrected. You're both, Margaret countered, and you have every right to be, but anger narrows vision, even for those with perfect sight. Thomas was silent for so long that Margaret thought he wouldn't respond. When he finally spoke, his voice held a vulnerability she rarely heard. I trusted him, Thomas said simply. When I woke in darkness after the accident, my first thought was concern for Lucas, whether he'd been hurt when the stallion spooked. Even as I learned to navigate a world without sight, I never suspected. He trailed off, jaw tight, with controlled emotion. Margaret reached across the space between their horses, her hand finding his arm. Betrayal by those we trust cuts deeper than any physical wound. If I'd known then what I know now, Thomas began. You'd have what? Margaret asked gently. Sought revenge, become bitter and isolated. She squeezed his arm before releasing it. Perhaps losing your sight saved you from losing your humanity. He turned toward her, his clouded eyes finding her with that uncanny accuracy. How do you do that? Do what? Find clarity in chaos, see purpose in tragedy. I've had practice finding patterns in difficult circumstances, Margaret replied. It's a survival skill for a woman alone in the world. Thomas nodded slowly. When this is over, he said with quiet determination, I want to hear every story, understand every lesson that shaped you. When this is over, Margaret echoed, the promise warming her despite the gathering clouds overhead. Cedar Ridge appeared before them as they crested a final hill, a town slightly larger than Willow, Greek, with a proper church steeple and brick buildings lining its main street. People moved with purpose along the boardwalks, seemingly unaware of the drama unfolding in their midst. Sheriff Hollis led them directly to the jailhouse, a solid stone building at the town center. Inside, a deputy with a bandaged head sat, glumly at a desk. This is Deputy Ferguson, Hollis introduced, the unfortunate recipient of Reed's escape plan. Didn't see a thing, Ferguson said ruefully. Was checking the cells when someone clubbed me from behind. Someone? Thomas questioned. Reed had help inside the jail? Hollis nodded grimly. Appears so. Only question is who? Who knew he was? Here? Thomas asked. That's the problem, Hollis sighed. Pretty much everyone. News travels fast in a small town. Margaret stepped closer to the cell where Reed had been held. The space was austere, a cot, a bucket, iron bars from floor to ceiling. Did he leave anything behind? Ferguson shook his head. Took everything. Wasn't much, just his boots, belt, and a small leather pouch he kept inside his shirt. What was in the pouch? Thomas asked sharply. Don't know, the deputy admitted. Prisoners get to keep personal effects that ain't weapons. Thomas turned to Hollis. Lucas always carried a silver medallion, St. Christopher, patron saint of travelers. His mother gave it to him before she died. Could be what was in the pouch, Hollis agreed. Why? Because if he still has it, it means something of the old Lucas remains, Thomas said quietly. The boy I grew up with had some goodness in him, before ambition poisoned his mind. Margaret heard the conflict in Thomas's voice, hatred for what Lucas had done, warring with memories of their former friendship. Sheriff? She asked. Did Reed say anything specific about his plans? Any mention of where he might go? Nothing useful. Hollis stroked his mustache thoughtfully, though he did say something odd the night before he escaped. Told my deputy he needed to return to the scene of creation. Whatever that means. Thomas went perfectly still. The ridge, he murmured. Devil's Backbone Ridge. What ridge? Margaret asked where Lucas and I made a blood pact as boys, Thomas explained, his voice distant with memory. We cut our palms and pressed them together, swore we'd build an empire together or die trying, said we were creating our destiny. Where is this ridge? Hollis asked, already reaching for his gun belt. 3 miles northeast of my ranch, Thomas replied, a rock formation that looks like a spine jutting from the earth. Lucas's father died there in a rock slide when we were 15. We made our pact at the spot a week later. Hollis nodded decisively. I'll gather my posse. We can be there by nightfall. No, Thomas countered. He'll hear a large group coming. I need to go alone. That's suicide, Hollis protested. I know the terrain better than anyone, Thomas insisted. And I know Lucas. If he's there, he's waiting for me specifically. Margaret stepped forward. I'm coming with you, Thomas shook his head firmly. Absolutely not. If you go alone, you're walking into a trap, Margaret argued. You need someone beside you, someone Reed might not expect. Carter, who had listened silently to the exchange, suddenly spoke. She's right, boss. Reed's expecting you to come charging in with the sheriff or alone, your pride making you predictable. A woman at your side changes the calculation. Thomas's jaw worked as he considered their arguments. Before he could respond, the jailhouse door burst open. A young boy rushed in, hat clutched in his hands, face flushed with exertion. "Sheriff!" he gasped. "Fire at the Peterson place, just outside town." Hollis swore under his breath. The Peterson ranch borders Blackwood land to the north. A distraction, Thomas said grimly. Reed's drawing attention away from his true destination. The sheriff hesitated, torn between duties. I have to see to the fire. Civilian lives could be at risk. Go, Thomas urged. Carter, Margaret, and I will head for Devil's Backbone. Send men to follow when you can. As Hollis hurried out with his deputy, Thomas turned to Margaret, his expression grave. This is your last chance to stay in town where it's safe. Margaret met his clouded gaze steadily. My place is with you, Thomas. For better or worse. Something shifted in his face. Resignation mingled with respect and something deeper, more profound. He reached for her hand, his fingers finding hers unerringly. For better or worse, he echoed, the familiar marriage vow taking on new weight, in the shadow of danger. Let's finish this. As they mounted their horses once more, Margaret glanced at the darkening sky. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon, mirroring the tension building within their small party. Somewhere ahead waited Lucas Reed, a man willing to betray his closest friend, a man who had waited 5 years to complete his revenge. The chase had begun, and with it a race against both human malice and approaching darkness. The one, environment where Thomas's compromised vision would leave him most vulnerable. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Margaret's horse stumbled on the rocky trail, jolting her from grim thoughts. The terrain had grown increasingly treacherous as they followed an old hunting path toward Devil's Backbone Ridge. Rain threatened in the heavy. Clouds overhead, the air thick with the metallic scent of an approaching storm. "We should reach the ridge before sunset," Carter said, pointing toward a distant formation where jagged rocks thrust upward like petrified waves. Assuming the weather holds, Thomas rode with unnerving confidence despite the challenging path. "If it rains, Reed will seek shelter in the old prospector's cabin, half a mile east of the ridge." "You seem certain he's there," Margaret observed. "It's where I would go," Thomas replied. "The place holds symbolic power for both of us, and practical advantages: visibility for miles, multiple escape routes, familiar ground. Carter dropped back slightly, giving them a measure of privacy. "Thomas," Margaret said quietly, "what will you do when you find him?" The question hung between them as Thomas considered his answer. 5 years ago I would have said kill him, without hesitation. Now, he shook his head. "I want justice, not vengeance. I want him to face what he's done in the light of day, not skulk in shadows. And if he forces your hand," Thomas's expression hardened, "then I'll do what's necessary to protect what I care about." The simple declaration, spoken without bravado, reminded Margaret of the fundamental strength she'd first sensed in him, not the brittle pride of wounded masculinity, but the quiet resolve of a man who understood both power and restraint. They rode in silence for another hour. The ridge, growing larger before them, the formation truly did resemble a spine, a series of stone vertebrae thrusting from the earth at improbable angles, testament to some ancient geological upheaval. "We should approach on foot from here," Thomas said as they reached a small copse of trees, less visible, and the horses would struggle with the incline. After securing the animals, Carter distributed weapons, Thomas's rifle, a pistol for himself, and after brief hesitation, a small derringer for Margaret. "Ever fired one of these?" Carter asked as he handed her the weapon. "No," Margaret admitted. But I understand the principle. Point and pull," Carter confirmed. "Just don't point it at anything you don't intend to shoot." Thomas's head tilted suddenly, his entire body going still. "Listen," he whispered. Margaret strained her ears, but heard only the rustle of leaves and distant bird calls. Carter, however, nodded in understanding. "Horse," the foreman murmured. "Northwest, maybe quarter-mile. Reed," Thomas confirmed grimly. They moved forward cautiously, using scattered boulders for cover. As they neared the base of the ridge, the wind picked up, carrying the first spatters of rain. Margaret pulled her shawl tighter, acutely aware of the derringer's weight in her pocket. "There's a path up the western face," Thomas explained softly. "Narrow but manageable. Reed will expect us to use it." "So we don't," Carter concluded. Thomas nodded. "We circle around. There's another route, steeper, but less exposed." As they began their circumspect approach, Margaret marveled at Thomas's recalled knowledge of the terrain. Despite 5 years of blindness, he navigated the landscape as if seeing it through memory, each footfall precise and confident. They had nearly reached the eastern approach when Carter suddenly grabbed Thomas's arm, halting their progress. The foreman pointed silently toward a rocky outcropping 50 yards ahead. At first, Margaret saw nothing. Then a slight movement caught her eye. A man crouched among the stones, rifle balanced on a rock, barrel aimed precisely at the western path Thomas had mentioned. "An ambush," Margaret whispered, "just as you predicted." Thomas nodded grimly. "Carter, circle north. Get behind him if you can. Margaret, stay with me." As Carter slipped away, Thomas led Margaret along a narrow deer trail that skirted the base of the ridge. Rain began falling in earnest, plastering her hair to her forehead and making the path treacherously slick. "How will you handle the confrontation?" Margaret asked, keeping her voice low. "If Reed can see and you can't." "I won't be at as much disadvantage as you might think," Thomas replied. 5 years of navigating the world through sound and touch has taught me to perceive things others miss. They paused at the base of a steep incline, scattered with loose shale. Thomas turned toward her, rain dripping from his hat brim. "Margaret," he said quietly, "if something happens to me—" "Don't," she interrupted. "We'll face this together and return to the ranch together." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I was merely going to say, if we're separated, head southeast. You'll reach the prospector's cabin I mentioned. It's defensible, with a solid door and shuttered windows." Before she could respond, a sharp crack split the air, a rifle shot, followed by another. Both came from the direction where they'd spotted Reed. "Carter," Thomas muttered, already moving toward the sound. They scrambled upward, loose rocks sliding beneath their boots. Thomas moved with surprising agility, using his hands to test the path ahead when necessary. As they crested a small plateau, the scene before them came into view. Carter crouched behind a boulder, clutching his arm where blood seeped between his fingers. 30 yards away, Lucas Reed was retreating toward higher ground, stopping occasionally to fire backward. "He's moving to the spine," Thomas called to Carter. "Are you hit bad?" "Grazed," Carter replied through gritted teeth. "I'll live." Thomas turned to Margaret, his expression grave. "Stay with Carter. Help bind his wound." "Where are you going?" she demanded, though she already knew the answer. "To end this," he replied simply. Before she could protest, he was moving along the ridgeline, following the sound of Reed's retreat with unerring accuracy. Margaret hurried to Carter's side, tearing a strip from her petticoat to bind his wounded arm. "How bad is it, really?" "Had worse shaving," the foreman grunted, though his pale face suggested otherwise. "You need to go after him. Boss can't face Reed alone." "He told me to stay with you," Margaret objected. Carter managed a pained smile. "And I'm telling you he needs you more than I do. Reed won't expect you, that's an advantage." After ensuring Carter's wound was securely bandaged, Margaret made a decision. Taking the derringer from her pocket, she checked that it was ready to fire, then began following the path Thomas had taken. The rain had intensified, turning the already treacherous ground into a slippery hazard. Margaret picked her way carefully, grateful for sturdy boots as she tracked the two men toward the highest point of the ridge. The spine itself was like nothing she'd seen before, a knife edge of stone with precipitous drops on either side. At the highest point stood a weather-beaten wooden cross, barely visible through the curtain of rain, marking, she presumed, where Lucas's father had died years earlier. Thomas and Reed stood 20 feet apart on the narrow spine, the cross between them. Even from a distance, Margaret could see that Reed matched Thomas in height and breadth, though his frame carried a gauntness that spoke of hard living. The left side of his face bore a network of burn scars, remnants of the fire he'd supposedly died in. Drawing closer but remaining sheltered behind a large boulder, Margaret could hear their voices carried on the wind. "You should have died in that fire, Lucas," Thomas was saying, his stance wary but balanced on the treacherous footing. Reed's laugh was a harsh, broken sound. "Disappointed, Thomas. I survived, just like you survived the trampling. We're hard to kill, you and I. Blood brothers, remember? You forfeited any claim to brotherhood when you tried to murder me," Thomas replied coldly. "Murder? No." Reed shook his head, rain streaming down his scarred face. "I just wanted to hurt you, to make you understand what it felt like to lose everything. The stallion was supposed to throw you, maybe break an arm or leg. I never expected—" He gestured toward Thomas's eyes. But you ran anyway, Thomas said. Left me for dead. Reed's expression hardened. I panicked. Then I heard you'd survived but lost your sight. Poetic justice, I thought. You were always so proud of your vision. How you could spot a lame steer at 500 yards. What do you want now, Lucas? Thomas demanded. The rustling, coming back here. What's your endgame? What's your endgame? What's rightfully mine? Reed snarled, his composure fracturing. Half the Blackwood Ranch. My father died working that land alongside yours. He gave his life for it. Your father was a paid foreman, Thomas countered. A good man who understood his position. His position? Reed's voice rose with indignation. 30 years he worked that land. 30 years while your father grew rich. My father compensated him fairly, Thomas replied, and I offered you partnership after my father died. You refused, demanding half ownership instead. Reed stepped closer to the cross, his rifle aimed at Thomas's chest. You never saw me as an equal. Even as boys, you were the heir and I was the help. The pact we made here meant nothing to you. Margaret edged closer, the derringer clutched. In trembling fingers, Reed's back was partially turned to her position, his attention fixed on Thomas. If she could get close enough. The pact meant everything, Thomas said, his voice dropping. But it was about honor, Lucas. About building something together through work and trust, not taking what isn't earned. Easy for the blind man to talk about seeing clearly, Reed spat. He raised his rifle higher. I should finish what I started 5 years ago. Margaret stepped from behind the boulder. Derringer aimed at Reed's back. Drop the rifle, she commanded, her voice steadier than her hands. Reed froze, then slowly turned his head. His eyes widened at the sight of her. A woman, in a rain-soaked dress, standing on Devil's Backbone, with a tiny gun pointed at his spine. Well, he drawled, a smile spreading across his scarred face. Thomas Blackwood got himself a protector. How touching. Margaret, get back, Thomas warned, his body tensing. Reed laughed. Margaret, is it? Did Thomas tell you what happened here? Margaret, how we cut our palms and mingled blood, swore we'd be brothers forever? He shifted slightly, keeping his rifle trained on Thomas while addressing her. Did he tell you he betrayed me first? Don't listen to him, Thomas said. There was a woman, Reed continued, ignoring Thomas. Catherine Vernon. We both loved her, but she chose me first. Then Thomas's father died, leaving him the ranch. Suddenly, Catherine decided she preferred being a rancher's wife to a ranch hand's. Margaret kept the derringer steady. Lower your weapon, Mr. Reed. He stole everything from me, Reed continued, his voice rising with each word. My future, my woman, my rightful inheritance, and now he's found another woman to fight his battles. I'm not fighting his battle, Margaret replied calmly. I'm protecting what's mine. Something in her tone made Reed hesitate. He glanced between her and Thomas, understanding dawning in his eyes. You're not just his nurse or housekeeper, you're his fiancée, Margaret confirmed. Reed's face contorted with fresh rage. Even blind, you get everything, he screamed at Thomas. Even blind! What happened next unfolded in heartbeats. Reed swung his rifle toward Margaret. Thomas lunged forward, guided by sound rather than sight. The cross that marked the death of Lucas's father splintered as Thomas crashed into it, driving his shoulder into Reed's midsection. Both men tumbled sideways, grappling at the edge of the precipice. Margaret screamed Thomas's name, rushing forward, as the rain-slick rock crumbled beneath their struggling forms. For one terrible moment, they hung suspended. Thomas gripping the ledge with one hand, his other fist clenched in Reed's shirt, as the man dangled over the abyss. Let me go, Reed shouted, terror replacing rage in his voice. We'll both fall. Thomas's muscles strained with the effort of holding them both. Give me your other hand, he gritted out. I can pull you up. Disbelief crossed Reed's scarred face. After everything I did to you? Because of everything we were to each other, Thomas replied. Take my hand, Lucas. End this madness. Margaret dropped to her knees beside Thomas, adding her strength to his, reaching toward Reed. Take our hands. For a moment it seemed Reed might accept salvation. His eyes met Margaret's, then Thomas's, something like recognition flickering in their depths. His hand rose, reaching upward. Then his fingers brushed the St. Christopher medallion hanging around his neck. Something shifted in his expression. Resignation replacing fear. Some debts can't be repaid, Thomas, he said quietly. Then with deliberate purpose, he released his grip on Thomas's shirt. No, Thomas shouted, lunging farther over the edge. But it was too late. Lucas Reed plummeted into the mist-shrouded chasm below, his body disappearing into the storm-lashed. The darkness. Margaret pulled Thomas back from the edge, her arms encircling him as rain mingled with tears on both their faces. For long moments they remained there, holding each other as the storm raged around them, two survivors on a ridge that had claimed another life. I tried to save him, Thomas whispered against her hair, his voice raw with emotion. Despite everything I tried, I know, Margaret soothed, her hand moving in gentle circles on his back. That's who you are, Thomas. That's why I love you. The words, never before spoken between them, hung in the rain-washed air. Thomas pulled back slightly, his clouded eyes seeking her face. Say that again, he requested softly. Margaret cupped, his face in her hands, thumbs tracing the raindrops from his cheeks. I love you, Thomas Blackwood, not despite your scars or limitations, but including them. They're part of the man you've become. He drew her closer, foreheads touching as the storm began to abate around them. And I love you, Margaret Byrne, you who saw value in a blind man when others saw only brokenness. As the rain gentled to a soft patter, they made their careful way back down the ridge to where Carter waited. The foreman had bandaged his arm using Margaret's improvised dressing and stood watching the ridge with evident relief at their appearance. Reed? He asked simply. Gone, Thomas replied, the single word carrying the weight of their shared history and its tragic conclusion. Carter nodded, asking no further questions. We should find shelter for the night. Storms passing, but darkness is coming fast. The prospector's cabin, Thomas decided. We'll rest there and return to the ranch at first light. As they collected their horses and made their way toward the cabin, Margaret walked beside Thomas, their hands occasionally brushing in silent communication. Something had shifted between them on that ridge, a deepening of their connection forged in crisis. The prospector's cabin proved small, but sturdy, with a stone fireplace and single room containing a rough-hewn table and bedframe. Carter busied himself building a fire while Thomas checked the perimeter, his other senses compensating for what his eyes could not perceive. Margaret stood in the doorway, watching the last light fade from the sky as stars began appearing between scattered clouds. The ridge was visible in the distance, its jagged silhouette a reminder of all that had transpired there. Thomas joined her, his hand finding hers with familiar certainty. What are you thinking? He asked softly. That some journeys end where they begin, she replied. Lucas returned to the place where your paths first joined and where they ultimately diverged. Thomas squeezed her hand gently. And what of our journey? Where does it lead? Margaret turned to face him, taking both his hands in hers. Forward, Thomas. Always forward. As darkness settled completely over the landscape, they stepped back into the cabin's warmth, closing the door on the past and turning toward a future neither could have imagined, when a plain woman from Boston stepped off the stagecoach to meet a half-blind rancher who would see her true beauty. See her true beauty, Eleanor replied. He's never been one for pageantry. I suspect if the decision were his alone, you'd have been married by the justice of the peace the day after returning from Devil's Backbone. The thought did cross his mind, Margaret admitted, with a soft laugh. But some moments deserve proper ceremony. A knock at the door heralded Mrs. Abernathy's arrival, her arms laden with wildflowers. "For your hair," the housekeeper explained, setting them on the dressing table. "Gathered from the North Meadow this morning, fresh with dew." Margaret touched the delicate blooms, purple lupine, golden black-eyed Susans, and tiny white stars she couldn't name. "They're perfect." Mrs. Abernathy's practiced fingers worked the flowers into Margaret's upswept hair, securing them with pins. "My mother always said a bride should carry a piece of the land she'll tend into her marriage," the older woman mused. "Seems fitting for the new mistress of Blackwood Ranch." The words sent a flutter through Margaret's stomach, not nervousness but the weight of responsibility. In a few hours she would be more than just Thomas's wife. She would help steward this land, these people who had welcomed her despite her plain appearance and Eastern ways. "There," Mrs. Abernathy declared, stepping back to admire her handiwork. Simple and elegant, like the bride herself. A commotion from the yard below drew them to the window. Dr. Sullivan had arrived, his buggy kicking up dust as it rolled to a stop. Unlike previous visits, he wasn't alone. A handsome woman in her 50s descended with his assistants, her bearing regal despite her years. "Thomas's Aunt Harriet," Eleanor explained, noting Margaret's questioning look. "Father's sister from Sacramento. I wasn't sure she'd make the journey." Margaret watched the woman survey the ranch with appraising eyes. "Will she approve of me?" "Aunt Harriet rarely approves of anything fully," Eleanor replied with a wry smile. But she respected Thomas enough to travel 3 days by rail and coach to attend his wedding. That's endorsement enough. Another knock interrupted them. Carter this time, standing awkwardly in the doorway, his good arm clutching a small wooden box. "Begging your pardon, Miss Byrne," the foreman said, his weather-beaten face uncharacteristically flushed. The boys and I, that is the ranch hands, wanted you to have this." He extended the box. "A wedding gift." Touched by the unexpected gesture, Margaret accepted the offering. Inside, nestled on a bed of cotton, lay a delicate silver chain supporting a small silver disc, a compass rose with intricate engraving. "It's beautiful," she breathed, lifting it carefully. "The boys pooled their wages," Carter explained, pride evident in his voice. "Had it made special by the silversmith in Cedar Ridge. Thought you might like something to remind you that you found your true direction here with us." Tears pricked Margaret's eyes. "I'll treasure it always." Carter cleared his throat, emotion making him gruff. "Boss is asking if you're about ready. Pastor Wilson's arrived, and folks are getting settled in the garden." Eleanor took the necklace from Margaret's hands, fastening it around her neck. "Tell my impatient brother his bride will be ready when she's ready, and not a moment sooner." After Carter departed, the women made final adjustments to Margaret's appearance, smoothing a ribbon here, adjusting a flower there. The simple veil, attached to a crown of baby's breath, was the last element added. "There," Eleanor declared, "every inch the radiant bride." Margaret turned to the mirror for a final assessment. The woman who gazed back bore little resemblance to the plain, travel-worn figure who had stepped off the stagecoach 4 months earlier. This woman's cheeks held healthy color. Her eyes sparkled with confidence and purpose. Her posture spoke of someone who knew her worth. "Ready?" Eleanor asked gently. Margaret nodded, gathering her modest bouquet of roses from the garden. "Ready." They descended the stairs, where Robert Hayes waited to escort her in the absence of a father or brother. The banker had proved, surprisingly, supportive throughout the preparations, his initial skepticism about Margaret giving way to genuine respect. "Miss Byrne," he greeted with a formal bow. "You look magnificent." "Thank you, Mr. Hayes," Margaret replied, accepting his proffered arm. The wedding had been arranged in the garden behind the main house, where apple trees from the orchard provided dappled shade for the gathered guests. A simple archway of twisted branches and summer flowers marked the spot where Thomas waited with Pastor Wilson. Chairs arranged in neat rows accommodated nearly 60 guests, townsfolk, neighboring ranchers, and friends from both Willow Creek and Cedar Ridge. As Margaret appeared at the garden's entrance, a collective murmur swept through the assembly. She kept her eyes fixed on Thomas, who stood tall and straight beside the pastor. Carter, serving as best man, leaned close to whisper something in Thomas's ear, undoubtedly describing Margaret's appearance. The simple notes of a fiddle began. A ranch hand with unexpected musical talent providing the wedding march. Margaret moved forward on Robert's arm, each step bringing her closer to the future she had never dared imagine in Boston. Thomas's face transformed as she approached, his clouded eyes seeking her, his expression one of unconcealed wonder. Though he couldn't see her clearly, he turned unerringly toward the sound of her footsteps, his smile growing with each passing moment. When Margaret reached his side, Thomas extended his hand, palm up. She placed hers within it, feeling the familiar calluses, the strength and gentleness that had become her anchor in this new life. "You're trembling," he whispered, his fingers closing around hers. "With happiness," she assured him. Pastor Wilson began the ceremony with measured words about devotion and partnership, but Margaret found herself focusing instead on the man beside her, on the journey that had brought them together against all odds. When the time came for vows, Thomas turned fully toward her, his clouded eyes finding her face with that uncanny precision. "Margaret," he began, his deep voice carrying clearly to the assembled guests, "when you arrived in Willow Creek, I was a man who thought blindness was my greatest trial. I was wrong." His fingers tightened gently around hers. "My greatest trial was learning to truly see, to recognize worth beyond appearance, strength beyond physical capability, beauty beyond what eyes perceive." A hushed silence fell over the garden as he continued. "You taught me that lesson. You, who society deemed too plain to merit attention, possess the truest beauty I've encountered. A heart that faces challenges without flinching, that offers compassion without condition, that loves deeply enough to risk everything." His voice softened. "I cannot see your face clearly today, but I see you, Margaret Byrne, more clearly than I've ever seen anyone in my life." Margaret blinked back tears as he finished. "I pledge to continue seeing you this way for all our days, to honor your strength, cherish your heart, and walk beside you in whatever path life presents. This I vow before all present and before God." When her turn came, Margaret's voice wavered only slightly. "Thomas, I came west seeking security but found something far more precious, the courage to be truly seen. All my life I was overlooked, judged lacking based on a glance. You, who society might deem damaged, taught me that true vision comes from the heart." She squeezed his hands, drawing strength from his steady presence. "I pledge to be your eyes. When you need them, your partner always, your equal in all things. To face whatever comes with the same courage you've shown in rebuilding your life. To remember always that our greatest strength lies not in what we can do alone, but in what we become together." Pastor Wilson guided them through the exchange of rings, simple gold bands that caught the summer sunlight. When he pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas didn't wait for permission to kiss his bride. His hands found her face with gentle precision, thumbs brushing away happy tears before his lips met hers in a kiss that held both promise and fulfillment. The celebration that followed stretched long into the evening. Tables laden with food occupied the ranch yard, lanterns were strung between posts, and the fiddle player was joined by other musicians for dancing. Margaret moved through it all, in her happy days, accepting congratulations from townsfolk who had become friends, from ranch hands who now looked to her as the mistress of Blackwood Ranch. "Mrs. Blackwood," Sheriff Hollis greeted, tipping his hat. "Finest wedding Willow Creek's seen in many a year." "Thank you, Sheriff," Margaret replied, still adjusting to her new name. Young Jenkins asked if you'd save him a dance, Hollis continued, with a wink. Boy's been sweet on you since you tended his wound during the rustling. Don't tell your husband I said so, Margaret laughed, a free and joyous sound. His secret is safe with me. As night fell completely, the celebration continued by firelight. Thomas found her among the dancers, his hand seeking hers with familiar certainty. Ready to escape? He murmured close to her ear. Carter's prepared the buggy. We could slip away while everyone's distracted by Mrs. Abernathy's apple pie. Margaret glanced around at the festivities. Wouldn't it be rude to leave our own wedding? Terribly, Thomas agreed with a roguish smile. But I find myself increasingly unwilling to share my wife with 60 guests. His wife. The word sent a pleasant shiver through Margaret. Where would we go? The cabin by the north pasture. I had it prepared as a surprise, his fingers interlaced with hers. Just us, away from well-meaning visitors and ranch business, for a few days at least. The prospect was undeniably appealing. Lead the way, Mr. Blackwood. They slipped away, with minimal fanfare. A few knowing smiles, a thumbs up from Carter, and Eleanor's assurance that she would make their excuses to the remaining guests. The buggy waited behind the barn, already loaded with provisions and Margaret's small travel case. Thomas took the reins with practiced confidence, guiding the horse away from the lights and sounds of celebration into the quiet darkness of the ranch's northern reaches. Happy? He asked as they traveled beneath a canopy of stars. Completely, Margaret replied, leaning against his shoulder, though I still find it hard to believe sometimes. What part? All of it. That I traveled 2,000 miles as a mail-order bride, that your sister's meddling actually led to something wonderful, that a half-blind rancher would see value in a woman deemed too plain by everyone else. Thomas reined the horse to a stop, turning toward her in the starlight. I wish you could see yourself through my senses, Margaret. Feel the strength in your hands, hear the wisdom in your voice, sense the beauty that radiates from you, not because of perfect features, but because of who you are. He traced her face gently with his fingertips, a gesture that had become his way of seeing her. In Boston, they called you plain because they looked without seeing. Here, you're beautiful because we see without needing to look. Margaret covered, his hand with her own, turning to kiss his palm. How is it possible to love someone more with each passing day? I don't know, Thomas admitted with a smile, but I intend to spend a lifetime finding out. As they continued their journey beneath the vast western sky, Margaret Blackwood reflected on the strange and wonderful path that had brought her here. From a rejected mail-order bride to the beloved wife of a man who saw with his heart rather than his eyes. From an invisible woman in Boston to a respected member of a community that valued substance over appearance. Some might call it luck or coincidence. Margaret knew better. It was recognition, two souls seeing past surface limitations to the true beauty beneath. A beauty no mirror could capture, no photograph could convey. The kind of beauty that only grows stronger with each passing year, each shared challenge, each moment of connection. The kind that would sustain them through all the seasons of their lives together. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.